Our next presenter is Emma Healy. Emma Healy is a traumatologist. I'm going to name Emma's, vocational identity. Emma will correct me if I got that wrong. But is just a gifted soul, doing a lot of work around this. Is also a sociologist and teaches at Elgin Community College as a professor. And so, without further ado, Emma Healy, Trauma-Informed Praxis in Spiritual Care.
So, my name is Emma Healy. As Reverend Rock mentioned, I am a traumatologist. I'm a sociologist by training. I have a full-time tenure-track professorship here in Chicagoland and also teach at a couple institutions in Boston, Massachusetts, including a medical school where I teach psychology and liberal arts to medical students. So a little bit of an overview of what we'll do today is talk about some of the background and research that I've done. We'll move into a discussion on trauma-informed praxis, and then hopefully get a chance to touch on something I'm calling liberation traumatology. So with that, let's get started. I am a part-time divinity student, so in my long and meandering time, eventually coming here to United Theological Seminary, I've been in a lot of conversation with care providers, both therapists and spiritual care providers, about the amount of trauma-informed care that they've actually received in their seminary or in their subsequent practice as faith leaders. And by and large, people are reporting that they are underprepared to companion those with trauma. And this is something that strikes me in an interesting way because trauma is something that we encounter so often in this line of work. As a sociologist, I want to posit that in a medical system that is so often commodified and in a mental health care system in particular that is so difficult to access, that faith leaders are at this unique intersection where they're actually positioned to provide forms of care to people who may not otherwise have access to it. And this idea of trauma-informed care becomes particularly salient. And so as we think about the need for trauma-based training, we also can name things like education and resourcing of care providers, including faith leaders, with the reality that many seminarians don't have the opportunity to study trauma, or if they do, it's only in the course of one class, if not a paragraph in a textbook. So when I transferred into United Theological this past fall, I hit the ground running and very quickly put together a research study going through the Institutional Review Board, who were kind enough to expedite my request, and came up with a qualitative, semi-structured, in-depth interview study on trauma-informed praxis in Catholic spiritual care. And this is the first of what I hope to be many in a series of studies that is looking at these central questions of what kind of care training are people receiving? Does that training include trauma? And if so, what did it constitute of? But if not, what is the actual need that spiritual and faith leaders are reporting is necessary in their work and within their context? This upcoming summer, I hope to continue and expand this study by pursuing a study on Muslim spiritual care with a diasporic community in Portugal, where a local imam did a grassroots effort of putting together a mosque that was essentially supported by the local municipality and serves a range of immigrants in the community. I also hope to continue this study into the future with some planned interviews with members of the United Church of Christ tradition, the ELCA Lutheran tradition, and then, of course, some other non-Christian denominations and faith traditions. The guiding questions as I'm entering this research and as I'm entering the projects that will emerge from it are, one, are spiritual care providers adequately prepared to meet the unique needs of trauma survivors and trauma survivorship? What trauma-based needs do congregants and congregations alike face in today's world? And of course, those answers will differ based on an urban versus a rural context or different parts of the country or world. What additional forms of training and resourcing are necessary for faith leaders to respond to these needs? And perhaps most importantly for my context, I'm curious to know that what what can happen that without a trauma-informed lens, what are the risks that spiritual care providers may pose to survivors seeking care? In other words, is there a possibility that with the best intentions, but the lack of resources, that there's actually a potentiality for re-traumatization? So with this, we can turn to some definitions of trauma. I'm just pulling one from the SAMHSA folks. Quote, trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Say what you want about politics today, but I think this is a functional definition of trauma. But I like to simplify it even further with this 3E model, thinking of the event, the experience, and the effects. And the reason why this is important is because it actually centers something a little bit different. So the event is asking what happened. Did it happen once or over a period of time? This is helping us get at whether the trauma is acute trauma. Was it a single incident? Was it an accident? Was it a natural disaster? Or was it a complex form of trauma? And we know that in trauma-informed care, there are different ways of approaching both of those. We also know from the research that people who survive things like natural disasters tend to have a much clearer trajectory toward healing than people who survive multiple incidents of trauma over a lifetime that is interpersonal in nature. Second, we're looking at experience. So how did the individual interpret the event? Was it physically, emotionally, or psychologically damaging for them? In this case, what I really want to highlight is we're not asking, does the individual meet the criteria as stated by a diagnostic manual, either the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders used here in the United States. I'm eyeing mine on my shelf over there, or the International Classification of Diseases, which is uplifted by the World Health Organization. We're not asking if they're meeting a set checklist of what qualifies as trauma and what might disqualify them for trauma. But instead, we're asking how were they impacted? What happened to them, and do they consider it a traumatic experience? And then finally, what are the effects of that? What are the lasting adverse impacts on that person's overall well-being? And again, drawing upon the inherent wisdom of lived experience rather than criteria that are set by diagnostic manuals or people who may not have traumatic experiences in their own pasts. So I want to turn our attention now to the difference between practice and praxis. And for this, I want to tell a story. In addition to interviewing faith leaders, I also have run a semi-informal study that I hope to turn into a formal one on care providers who are therapists, counselors, and other mental health professionals, and asking their approach to trauma and about their training. And one provider in particular gave me some very interesting advice that he was given from one of his supervisors when he was in his training process, which was that when he approaches the treatment of trauma as a trauma expert, he is very careful about this process because it is as though a person is drowning. And as the person trying to help them, you have to make sure that you don't swim out into the deep water and potentially go under with them. In fact, he saw his role in trauma healing as somebody who stands on the shore, who is able to see what's going on, perhaps throw a life preserver or one of those round things that you have a rope tied to. And in the worst of scenarios, he said that it was his job to go into the shallows and pull somebody in. And for a moment, I thought, well, this is a really salient analogy. What a beautiful metaphor. But the more that I thought about it, the more complicated it became, because I realized that if you have framed a person as drowning, then every breath they take is going to look like suffocation. So I offer instead an alternative model, and that is one of praxis. And in my metaphor, in my mind, I draw upon my experiences on the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, which is a pilgrimage in Spain, dating back pre-medieval era, where people walk toward a destination that is holy or sacred. This is something present in many different faith traditions. But in a metaphor of healing, what we think of as somebody drowning might actually be somebody doing the best they can with what they have. And it's our job, our role as care providers to trust that they will emerge from the water, perhaps shaking, perhaps trembling, perhaps cold, perhaps dripping wet. and that they will be able to continue on in this walk and this journey toward healing. And it is our job to work with them, to companion them, and to be there alongside them, knowing that we can't always carry their burdens, knowing that we may be wearing, in some cases, hiking shoes and they may be barefoot, that perhaps the path we are walking on is paved and the one they are walking on is covered in sharp stones, knowing that we ourselves may have a first aid pack on us that may or may not be able to be put to use, and that it's our role as part of this is to help read the map together in discerning where we're going. So I make this distinction between practice and praxis. And in first, I'm not the first person to do this. I'm drawing upon the work of Paulo Freire, who, as we know, wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so practice in this model is essentially describing the application of standardized skills or protocols. It's using a manualized, fixed, or one-size-fits-all approach to treat trauma survivors. And in my understanding and research, this can often take a deficits-based approach. It can sometimes make decisions without collaboration and also can make the mistake of assuming that if a person is not improving or getting better, it's the fault of the individual rather than actually interrogating the model. If we contrast that with praxis, we see that this is a more active, reflective, and co-creational process, that it requires the care provider to be in continual dialogue, interrogating their own assumptions, their theological bases, and ethical frameworks, and is both reflective and reflexive, centering the individual needs of survivors, being a more strengths-based approach. If I had an hour to expound, I certainly would, but I'll save us that, and hopefully there will be some questions. So the way that I like to think about this is moving from a model of what's wrong with you, and asking something like, what happened? We're getting a little closer to what's going on here. But even more salient than that, what happened to you? Completely reframing this from a matter of kind of personal agency or responsibility for suffering to actually acknowledging that there's a context in which somebody is living, that trauma has taken place. And if we put this within a spiritual context, we might ask, what do you need? So this brings us to trauma-informed praxis in spiritual care. I'm going to highlight two core ideas that I see and envision as being most central to this. The first of which is companioning, which is a presence that we are enacting alongside survivors in their journey through healing. We understand the importance of a gentle, non-anxious presence, and for this reason, we are not going before them or behind them, but we are with them. We are co-partners in this journey, even knowing that as we carry our own burdens, just having someone with us can lighten that load. The second piece of this is witness, and these are very loaded terms, some of which you may recognize to be religious or spiritual in nature, but more than just observing, this is involving a relational, validating, and active presence. It involves the depths of understanding that allowing a survivor's story to be deeply heard and deeply known. I like to think of witness as witness. So there's some ways that we can start to arm ourselves, at least with a little bit of background knowledge of how trauma works and functions. And again, I wish I had all the time in the world to expound. But the first thing I want to put forth is the triune brain model, which is not without controversy, but I think is a really helpful way of thinking about how the brain works in relationship with trauma. Sometimes people will use a fist to describe this as well. So we're going to start from the left-hand side of the screen in the lower regions of the brain. This is the brain stem. You could point to your kind of wrist for this. And this is the oldest evolutionary part of the human brain. It was the very first to develop. It has the reptilian ancient structures that keep your heart beating, your lungs oxygenating. It keeps all things running without you having to think so much about it. And as we move up to this blue layer of the brain, we have kind of the base of the fist where we're looking at the limbic structures. And the limbic structures become important for a couple of reasons, one of which is that they're also quite old, but they contain two brain structures that are really important in trauma encoding and trauma, what eventually will become trauma processing. The first of which is something called the amygdala, sometimes talked about as the brain's watchtower. This is a center of the brain that has the ability and capacity to process emotions like anger and like fear. The second structure is the hippocampus, which is right next to the amygdala. And the hippocampus, if you remember from your Psych 101 class, is the place that memory begins to be stored and encoded. And you can think from an evolutionary perspective, it makes a lot of sense that human beings have this brain structure that basically puts the fear center and the memory center right next to each other, because you would want to have a memory of things that were harmful to you or to people that you care about. As we move up into the green portion of the brain, this is where we get into the cortical structures. Sometimes people will even put a hand on top of their fist because this is the layer that really makes us human, especially that dark green in the very front of our brains, the prefrontal cortex, which is allowing for us to do things like rational thought, prioritization, planning, critical thinking. And when we put this in a trauma perspective, when we think about some of the models that use cognitive or behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral modification, there's one interesting thing that we can do to regulate, which is taking a deep breath. It's one way that we can actually intentionally tap into our nervous system that can help to bring us out of a lower brain region, one that is perhaps dominated by fear or anger, and into a higher cortical structure. So there's some actual science behind why deep breathing is so important, but I will say that it's not everything in trauma processing. Another model that you'll often see is the window of tolerance model. We could complicate this all day. There are so many models that I would love to share. But the basic gist of this is that in this middle band, you have the window of tolerance. This is the rest and digest place in your parasympathetic nervous system. You're feeling safe, you're feeling regulated, you're feeling calm. This is where you can do self-reflection or introspection. This is where creativity can happen. And then as we move out of this into a heightened state in hyperarousal, this is the fight or flight state where we're overwhelmed, anxious, and need to escape. We might hyperventilate or shake. This is actually also coincidentally where freeze lives, although you would think that it wouldn't be there. You think it would be the opposite, but there's some actual science to that. And then as we go below the window of tolerance, you find hypoarousal, which is a flop state. And this is where people might feel disconnected, dissociated, detached, and experience things like extreme fatigue or numbness. Or sometimes that can even manifest as something that looks like depression, but is actually a trauma response. So I talked a little bit before about these 4 questions, and hopefully we're moving toward a place of actually asking people what they need in order to be okay. Naming that somebody who's in a trauma response may not actually know what they need, and sometimes it's a very helpful thing to offer. You know, if someone has lost a loved one, don't ask them what they need, but offer to bring them dinner and ask them what day of the week might be a good day for them, or what are their favorite restaurants, and get them a gift card from those places. But as we move beyond what do you need, I ask another question, which is what does it mean to heal? And so this is where we're going to land in something that I'm naming liberation traumatology, which is emerging from multiple fields, including liberation theology, liberation psychology, and using the lens of sociology to take a systems approach. It is centered on 4 principles of autonomy, agency, self-determination, and consent, and ultimately believes, in the words of Paulo Freire, that liberation is praxis. This also centers the hope that people are not pathologies, and it infuses a sociological perspective to understand how a failure to address systems is a failure to support survivors. It believes that neutrality means taking the side of the oppressor. And so in this model, something like a clinical neutrality would actively be discouraged as something that could be harmful or even re-traumatizing. For this, I want to do a brief lesson on one of my favorite sociologists by the name of Johan Galtung. He was from Norway. And he gives us this model of the conflict triangle. He's probably best known for his contributions to peace, war, and conflict studies. But we'll start at the top, talking about direct violence, which is something in society that is the most easily observable. It includes things like maiming, punching, killing, other forms of explicit violence. And this is something that people really tend to latch onto because it is so easily understood. And it's a type of violence where both victim and offender are easily identifiable. But in traumatology, we know that victim and offender are not always so easily identifiable. In fact, there could be an entire traumatology of victimhood, because when somebody is a survivor of violence, they know they have to perform a role of perfect victim in order to be believed. That if they don't express enough anger, they're seen as, well, perhaps it wasn't that bad. Or if they express too much anger, then perhaps they're unreliable because they're vindictive. That if they are too distressed, they're an unreliable narrator. But if they're not distressed enough, then maybe it wasn't that bad. And this is where we get into some additional forms of violence in a sociological context to understand how and why trauma works the way it does. Next, we'll look at the model of structural violence, which is the violence that is built into society, into those social, economic, and political structures. It's often very silent, unless you think about it or talk to a sociologist. It doesn't tend to show itself, and it's not readily perceivable. And it's pervasive throughout society because it serves to maintain the status quo. So think of things like a healthcare system that is a pay-to-play model, or a justice system where hiring a better lawyer means that you're often able to access forms of justice that you wouldn't be able to access if you couldn't afford it. The third form here is cultural violence, which are the aspects of culture that justify and legitimize violence. These can be based in the kinds of language that we use. The fact that we say mankind is a basic example of that. Also, forms of art, science, theological ideas, and other things. Think of the ways in which some traditions might say the sanctity of marriage is more important than perhaps getting out of an abusive situation. Or if you look at the media, think of the ways in which sometimes the media will paint a man who has killed his entire family as a family man, or the term child prostitute, where those of us who know anything about consent would say the words child and prostitute don't belong in the same sentence because a child cannot consent. That is, in fact, rape. And so what cultural violence does is changes the moral color of violent acts such that we no longer perceive them as violent. It essentially normalizes the violence that takes place in society. So for this, I want to draw our attention to a quote by the great Judith Herman in her seminal book, Trauma and Recovery. She writes, quote, "It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering." As we look toward a liberation traumatology, I want to uplift Judith Herman's model. I'm framing it in a slightly different way, but I want to remind us that a model like this is not always necessarily meant to take place in order in the stages. Similar to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, they're not meant to be experienced by every single person in the exact same way. We circle back, and it actually tends to look more like a scribble than a straight line. But we start typically with resourcing. When somebody is in crisis or going through trauma, in the direct aftermath, we want to make sure that there is some kind of stability. So this involves things like establishing safety, both physical and emotional, addressing symptoms or building a foundation. And this is where modalities for therapy, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, action and commitment-based therapy, cognitive processing therapy, any of those cognitive or modification forms, which again, us Psych 101 people remember that those are operant forms of conditioning. These are or tend to be the frontline defense for this resourcing stage, but they are not, in fact, trauma processing modalities. And if what we do is address symptoms, then we're not actually treating or even acknowledging the underlying cause of trauma. So in Herman's model, we can look to processing, which is actually identifying what happened, telling one's story in a way that is both heard and held, knowing that a story in trauma is often not a linear process and is one that takes a very gentle, careful attunement and belief of others to even begin to understand for oneself. Some forms of therapy that tend to approach this can be coherence therapy, somatic therapies like somatic experiencing, internal family systems, which you may have heard of as parts work, EMDR, which is the eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, brain spotting, and other forms of therapy. From there, we would have Judith Herman tell us a little bit about something called integration, which is where we're reconnecting with the sense of ourselves. We're living now from a place of healing, and we're trying to build trust both in ourselves and others. And this can involve things like meaning making from our experiences, trying to live well, trying to live from a place of love, and perhaps even engaging in advocacy. And 33 years after Judith Herman published Trauma and Recovery, she just a couple years ago came out with a book called Truth and Repair, where she interviewed people who had gone through traumatic experiences and were seeking justice. And so justice now becomes this fourth step where there is a societal recognition of harm, shifting blame from the survivor to the perpetrator where it belongs. And this involves things like at least an aspiration toward accountability, laws, rituals of lamentation, and hopefully a social change. So I leave you with one last quote. Healing is among the most meaningful work we will ever be called to do. Thank you so much for your time and attention today.